What is going on, boys? Welcome back to another video. Today is the start of a new weekly series. I'm going to be giving you guys all of my reactions to week 1, all of the storylines, all of the deployment changes, everything that you need to know. There's a lot of info packed in this, so you're going to want to listen up. Let's dive right into it. The first thing that I want to talk about is some disappointing news. We're going over the injury updates. Matt Boldy of the Minnesota Wild is out week to week with a shoulder injury. He's not going on LTIR, but still, guys, this is super disappointing. Based off what we saw during the second half of last year, I really did think Boldy was going to have a massive season. I think when he comes back, he's still going to be great. But it does suck, obviously, if you own Boldy. He could be out for a month or even more. In fact, I did bet on a future involving Boldy. I bet for him to get 30 plus goals, and that's obviously in jeopardy. That's not going to hit, so it sucks all around. Hopefully, there's a speedy recovery, and he can be back in the next couple of weeks. And then we got even worse news. Kirby Dach is out indefinitely with a long-term injury. I just wanted to edit this in, guys. We found out that Kirby Dach has a torn ACL and MCL in his knee. That is a season-ending injury, and he might not even be ready for training camp next year. So absolutely terrible stuff for Dach, the Canadians, all the Canadians fans out there. I wish Dach a speedy recovery. And yeah, just really tough news. Next up, we have Victor Arvidsson of the Los Angeles Kings. He just had surgery on his back. He's going to be out long term. And this is disappointing if you own Arvidsson. He was situated on that top power play unit. He's a guy that scores a lot of goals and takes a lot of shots. So very disappointing, but you'll have players like Pierre-Luc Dubois rising from this because he's going to be on that top unit. And then we have Pavel Buchnevich of the St. Louis Blues. This is not a serious injury based off what we've heard. It's only going to be 1 to 2 weeks. We know Buchnevich is a little bit of a band-aid. He always misses time, so hopefully this is his only injury. He gets it out of the way, and he comes back and can put up a lot of points. I also wanted to mention some other injury updates. Rupe Hintz is day-to-day, but he's back practicing without restrictions, so I do expect him to be back. We have Robbie Fabry, who's day-to-day. We don't think is a serious injury, but he did get banged up a little bit there. We also have Jared Spurgeon, who is out week to week. He's not close to returning at all. So you have some other defensemen on the Wild potentially getting a bump in fantasy relevance. We also got confirmation today that Brandon Tanev suffered a lower body injury and is going to be out 4 to 6 weeks. And then finally, we have Steven Stamkos, who's day-to-day. He might miss their road trip coming up. So that's tough for Tampa fans, for you guys that own Stamkos. They don't believe it's a long-term injury, but definitely keep an eye on how that progresses. Just before we get into the risers and fallers, I wanted to show you guys my picks for Drafters Fantasy Sports tonight. If you guys like gambling, it's available in all of Canada. It's available in most of the US. You can do drafts on there. You can do pick'ems. The link is in the description, guys. It's on iOS or Android as well. All you got to do is sign up using referral code FIREDUP, and when depositing a minimum of $20 using promo code FIREDUP, they will match it 100% up to $100, guys. It's the best promo code out there, so check it out, guys, and gamble responsibly. All right, so how we're going to structure this video is we're going to do risers and fallers. We have almost 60 players on this list that I'm going to be talking about, so grab your popcorn, grab a seat, get buckled up, man. There's a lot of info in there. We're going to be going over deployment, and I'm going to be giving my takes on a lot of these players, starting off with Brock Boeser of the Vancouver Canucks. Obviously, Brock Boeser has been off to an extremely hot start. 4 goals in a total of 5 points in 2 games. 4 of those goals coming in 1 game against the Oilers when they won 8-1. Obviously, this is not sustainable, but I do think Brock Boeser is a guy that is going to have a good season this year, and let me tell you why. The first obvious reason is that the Canucks have a lot of offensive weapons on their team. Elias Pettersson, Ondrej Kuzmenko, JT Miller, and I think Quinn Hughes is also going to take another step forward this season. But the big reason why Boeser, I think, is a sleeper and why I think he's going to continue performing is his power play time. Now, this is a very small sample size, but through 2 games, he's averaging 4 minutes of power play time per game. That's 4th among Canucks. If you compare this to last year, he was only averaging 2 minutes of 54 seconds of power play time per game. He wasn't a staple on that first unit. He was basically splitting time with Kuzmenko. With Horvat gone, it's going to give him the opportunity to get more power play time, and that means more fantasy production. You also have to consider that in the last couple of seasons, Boeser has been through a lot in his personal life. That could have been a factor in his inconsistency. We've seen Boeser in his first couple of seasons be on pace for 65 plus points, 70 plus points. He has the talent, and with the deployment now that he's getting, I think there is a lot of potential with Boeser. Overall, guys, if you added Boeser on the waiver wire, I would suggest holding on to him. I wouldn't sell high on him just yet. I think he will have a good season based off this deployment. We'll see how it all plays out, but a lot of potential, like I said. Now we're going to be talking about some fallers. We have the Edmonton Oilers goaltending. Stuart Skinner and Jack Campbell, obviously they both played horrible. We had Skinner letting in 4 goals on 16 shots in both of the games that he played. Campbell obviously got pulled in the first game against the Canucks. And I would say this is more so an issue for Stuart Skinner owners. Campbell's a guy that was drafted in the last couple of rounds, so people didn't really have high expectations of Jack Campbell. But last season, Stuart Skinner was great, so this is obviously disappointing. Now, I wouldn't necessarily panic yet. The Oilers should be a playoff team, meaning there's going to be a lot of wins for both of these goalies. But the big issue that I have is with Stuart Skinner's fantasy value. In points leagues, tandems are not ideal, right? Let's just say the Oilers play 3 times in a week. Then one of these goalies that week is only going to have 1 start. That's not good for maximizing your games. I'd much rather have a forward that I can pick up for the entire week that plays 4 games and 3 off nights. That's going to give me way more fantasy points than having Jack Campbell sitting in my lineup the entire week, only giving me 1 start. I'm just really not a fan of tandems in points leagues, so this is bad news for Stuart Skinner, especially if he keeps playing like this. Campbell could steal some starts from him. I don't want to see a split. The best case scenario is that Skinner can bounce back and become the #1 starter again like he did last year, so do not panic just yet, but definitely a faller for this week. The next riser I want to talk about is Nicholas Paul of the Tampa Bay Lightning. Through 3 games, he is 4th on the Tampa Bay Lightning in power play time. He is on that first unit. In fact, he has more power play time per game than Braden Point, which is wild. I know it's a super small sample size, but this is very good for his fantasy value. He's basically stepped into the Alex Killorn role. Nick Paul, he's a big body. He's going to be on that bumper on the power play. And we'll see if it sticks, right? If we're looking at last year's power play time, Killorn and Hagel split. I do think we're going to see him going back and forth on the first unit and the second unit. And if he gets time on that first unit throughout the season, playing with Kucherov, Stamkos, Hedman, and Braden Point, he's going to put up a lot of points, especially with those peripherals. So keep an eye on his deployment. If you're in a deeper league, you probably got a big steal. If you're in a more shallow league, I would say hold on to him if your league value shots, hits, and blocks. Really promising stuff for Nicholas Paul in fantasy. The next riser is another Lightning player. It's Victor Hedman. And listen, guys, I know I told you not to draft Victor Hedman. To my defense, he was a guy that I thought was going a little bit higher than he should have. His Yahoo ADP was going above Miro Heiskanen. He was going like 20 picks ahead of Sergachev. I thought it was a risky pick, so I wanted you guys to proceed with caution and not take him in drafts, but it's looking like that was a really bad take because he's been incredible so far for looking at point production. He is on the first line power play. Sergachev is not getting reps on there. So if you drafted Victor Hedman in one of these later rounds, like round 5, round 6, round 7, you probably got some great value. What I will say is that it's only 3 games into the season. Obviously, Hedman is the veteran. He is the guy that's been on that first unit for so many years, so they're going to give him every chance possible. But if he struggles or the Tampa Bay Lightning power play struggles, they might switch things up and give Sergachev reps on the first line power play. That could be a situation to look out for. We did see in the preseason them go back and forth with Sergachev and Hedman on the first unit. So we'll see how it plays out, but it's Hedman's spot to lose at this point. Hedman has 1 power play point in 3 games. It was a goal. He has a total of 5 points in 3 games. So he's playing really well. He's doing really good in fantasy. We'll see if that changes, but for now, you probably got a huge steal with Hedman if you drafted him, and if you own him, hopefully you can keep this up. Moving on, we have an obvious faller. We have Mikhail Sergachev. I'm going to keep this brief because I described the situation in the Hedman section, but basically Sergachev has not gotten looks on the first line power play through 3 games. Hedman has 5 points in 3 games, so you're basically going to need Hedman to underperform on the power play, or the Lightning as a whole to underperform on the power play, in order for Sergachev to get put on that first unit to get reps there. We'll see how it all plays out, but for now, Sergachev is definitely had a huge blow to his fantasy value. If you drafted Sergachev over Hedman, it might not work out for you. Again, I'm sorry guys for telling you guys not to draft Hedman. You can't predict these things, and we saw in preseason them going back and forth. I just went with what I saw last season. Sergachev played much better on that first unit. Cross your fingers that Sergachev can find himself back on the first unit, but I'm not getting my hopes up. Next up, we got to talk about Luke Hughes of the New Jersey Devils. And basically what the Devils are doing right now is splitting their power play into 2. I don't know if this is going to stick because we know historically it's more efficient to run a dedicated first unit and a dedicated second unit. But still, guys, if this continues, it is going to benefit Luke Hughes quite a bit. We have a very small sample size here, obviously only 2 games, but through these 2 games, Luke Hughes has the 3rd most power play time per game amongst Devils players. I will say that watching the Devils games, Luke Hughes has made some silly rookie mistakes. It looks like he's playing pawn hockey out there. He's got to have better control of the puck. But the fact is that Luke and Jack are brothers. They have that connection. They have that chemistry. The Devils are going to experiment with their power play lines because they have so much talent. They're trying to figure out what works. But if they do decide to run 2 dedicated units, whichever players are playing with Jack Hughes are going to be the ones that benefit the most. So if they do decide to pair Luke and Jack together, that means Luke is going to be relevant in fantasy quite a bit. Definitely keep an eye on him. We'll see how it all plays out, but his stock has certainly went up. We have another Devils player that has served to benefit from the way that they're running their power play unit, and it's Tyler Toffoli. He's currently playing on the top line, even strength with Jack Hughes, and right now he is 4th among Devils players in power play time per game. That's ahead of Hischier, ahead of Hamilton, ahead of Meier. Again, like I said earlier, they are going to experiment with these lines. It is subject to change, but for now, Toffoli's stock has certainly went up. I was concerned with Toffoli because I wasn't sure if he was going to be on the first unit, but now it's looking very promising. So definitely hold on to Toffoli and hopefully he can have some big nights. And then finally, the last riser on the Devils is Ondrej Palat. If we're looking at power play time per game, he is 5th among Devils players. He has more power play time per game than Nico, Hischier, Dougie Hamilton, and Timo Meier. Again, this could change, but very, very promising. We also saw today in practice, they moved him up to the top line with Hischier and Meier. This is because the Timo Meier, Nico Hischier, and Dawson Mercer line was not working out at all. So if Palat can get top 6 minutes and get this type of power play deployment, then his stock is going way up. Things are looking very promising, but again, we will see how everything plays out with the Devils power play. The two players that saw their stock decrease from the way the Devils are running their power play units are Timo Meier and Nico Hischier. In fact, if we're looking at power play time per game, I know it's a small sample size, only 2 games. Meier was 8th amongst Devils players with 2 minutes and 23 seconds. Hischier is a little bit better at 6th with 3 minutes and 9 seconds of power play time per game, but they both are behind Toffoli and Palat in power play time per game, which is not something I expected going into the season. I thought they were going to run a dedicated first unit. Now, like I said earlier, things can change. They're experimenting with lines, trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. But for now, the stock has definitely dropped with these two guys. I still believe in Nico Hischier. He was a guy that I labeled as a must-draft forward because I thought he was going to be playing alongside Jack Hughes on the first unit. I think they're eventually going to switch to a dedicated first unit with Hischier on it, but only time will tell. Now, if we're talking about Timo Meier, this was a guy I didn't draft a lot of this year because I had my concerns. His ADP was very high, and I just didn't think he was worth it at his price. The main concern is that there are a lot of mouths to feed in this offense. That means less power play time, less total ice time per game. That's not good for fantasy, right? We also know that Meier last season struggled with the Devils after he got traded from the Sharks, and that was definitely concerning. We also saw his shot volume go down quite a bit. He was taking 1 less shot per game on the Devils than he was on the Sharks, so that was one concern I had with Meier. We will see what happens because apparently Meier is a notoriously slow starter. In his first 9 games last year with the Sharks, he only had 2 assists, no goals. So maybe Meier can pick it up. If they're experimenting with lines, maybe they can find a line that clicks. It's too early to tell, but I would be concerned with Meier. I'm going to be completely honest. Overall, for Meier to be worth it where he got drafted, he needs to get back on the first unit. The Devils need to run a dedicated first unit. He needs to be playing on that first unit with Jack Hughes. If that doesn't happen, then yes, you do need to be concerned. Now we're going to be talking about some Blue Jackets players. First off, we have Boone. He is a riser. He had a hat trick on Saturday, and this guy was extremely good last year. I don't know if people realize this. He was on pace for over 30 goals. His peripherals are absolutely incredible, shots, hits, and blocks. And there was some concern with Jenner going into the season because we weren't sure if he was going to still be on that first unit, but he is still on that unit. They are experimenting with power plays a bit, but it seems like he's still going to get top 6 minutes. He's still going to get significant power play time, so I definitely think you should add this guy before it's too late. The next Blue Jackets player we're going to be talking about is Kirill Marchenko. I've been talking about this guy for 2 months, and he has looked great so far throughout the season. He has 3 assists in 2 games, which is definitely unexpected because he only had 4 assists in 59 games last season, but he had like 23 goals. So he's known for being a goal scorer. Maybe he worked on his playmaking abilities. Hopefully there's going to be a better balance of that, but I do want to see him score some goals. So far through these 3 games, he's getting good power play time. We've seen him on the first unit. During the preseason, he was on a line with Line and Gaudreau, and they were on absolute fire. Unfortunately, they haven't used that line in the regular season just yet. I'm sure they're going to put that line together at some point. They're mixing up lines. Marchenko, he was getting some reps on the 3rd line. Tonight, as I'm recording this, he's going to play on a line with Gaudreau and Jenner. That's going to be the first line for the Jackets. So we'll see how his deployment ends up, but it looks like he is going to be a lock on that first unit, which means that he's going to have a lot of value this season. I highly suggest you pick this guy up. The last Blue Jackets player I want to talk about is goaltender Elvis Merzlikins. I understand he was terrible last year, and I'm not saying he's going to be some fantastic goalie, especially if you're in a category league. But if you're in a points league that values volume, then Elvis is going to be your guy. I think if he continues to play decent, he's going to get a lot of starts. We saw him get a lot of starts in the 2021-2022 season, and that's why last year I thought he was a big sleeper in drafts. Unfortunately, he was terrible. The Blue Jackets were terrible. But if the Blue Jackets can manage to stay healthy and they can be a semi-competitive team, then Elvis is going to be a good goalie that you could probably pick up off the waiver wire for free. So if you're in desperate need for a goalie, take a look at Elvis. Only if you're in a points league, right? In a category league, his stats aren't going to be that great, but in a points league that value saves, he's going to have some good weeks. Next up, I want to talk about some Carolina Hurricanes players. We have Seth Jarvis, and listen guys, I understand that he only has 1 assist in 3 games, only 1 point, but still his deployment is very promising. If we're looking at his time on ice, it is very high, especially on a team like Carolina that runs a very balanced offense. It's a very small sample size of 3 games, but playing almost 20 minutes a night is very promising. And if we're looking at his power play time, it's also promising. He's on the first unit, which is what we saw during preseason and training camp. That is why I identified him as a breakout candidate. He is getting the second most power play time per game on the Carolina Hurricanes right now. So this is great for his fantasy relevance. If he stays on that first unit, playing on the top line with Aho as well, I think he's in for a great season. I can see him putting up 60 plus points. We'll see how it all plays out, but I think if you want to add him for long term, he could pay off. The next Canes player is defenseman Tony DeAngelo. He was a guy that probably went super late in drafts because people didn't realize that he was going to be on the first unit. We got some reports at a training camp that he was going to play alongside Brent Burns on that unit. So I immediately started drafting him a lot in my best ball drafts on Drafters Fantasy Sports. And he has played really good so far. He has 2 power play assists in 3 games, and he's third in power play time per game on the Hurricanes, just behind Seth Jarvis and Michael Bunting. I don't think he is going to get bumped off that unit. In fact, he's getting almost a minute more than Brent Burns in power play time per game. Again, small sample size, but very promising stuff. When he was on the Hurricanes in 2021-2022, he had 10 goals and a total of 51 points in 64 games. So if he could have a similar type of season, you probably got a huge steal in your drafts, and I think he's going to be pretty good for the rest of the year. All right, the last Hurricanes player I want to talk about is Brent Burns. Now, obviously, he has a goal and an assist in 3 games, which is great, but his deployment is a little bit concerning. He's 6th in power play time per game on the Canes, but Tony DeAngelo almost has a minute more in these 3 games that we've seen. We also saw in last night's game against the Ducks, we saw Natchez get on that first unit and score, and Brent Burns was bumped down to the second unit. So definitely concerning, especially if Svechnikov comes back. They might just run Tony DeAngelo on that first unit and then have Brent Burns on the second unit. I've also identified Brent Burns as a regression candidate because his shooting percentage was very high. He's getting older, guys. I think he's 38 years old, about to be 39. If he's bumped down to that second unit, it definitely is a major blow to his fantasy value. So keep an eye on the deployment of this power play. Moving on to some Coyotes players, we have defenseman Sean Durzi. This is a guy that I've been telling you to draft for the last 2 months now. We basically got confirmation that they traded for him to be on that first unit, and he's looked great so far. I know it's only 1 game that we've seen him in, but he basically was a staple on that first unit. He scored a goal, and I think it's really going to elevate this power play. So if you're in need for a defenseman, make sure you target Durzi on your waiver wire. He's probably been picked up. If you added him or you drafted him, I say you hold on to him. I think if he stays healthy, there is a potential for him to put up 50 to 60 points, and that is going to be pretty great in fantasy. The second Coyotes player I want to talk about is rookie Logan Cooley. We saw how great he played in preseason, and in the first regular season game, there was a lot to be excited about. He had a ton of power play time. He had 2 assists on the power play in his first game. So I think things are extremely promising with Logan Cooley. I'm just really excited about this deployment, guys. Cooley had 19 minutes of total ice time in that first game that they played in. So if he's getting top 6 minutes on the first line power play, there is potential for him to put up 60 plus points. The next riser is James Van Riemsdyk of the Boston Bruins. Good old JVR. We saw him score 2 goals on Saturday night, both of them being power play goals. And the reason he's a riser is because he's playing on the first line power play unit with David Pastrnak. Not a lot of people expected JVR to be on the first line power play unit. In fact, I thought it was going to be Jake DeBrusk. But if JVR can manage to stay there, that means a lot for his fantasy value. Now, we did see during practice, they shook up the lines a little bit. Initially, JVR was playing on the top line with Pastrnak, but now he's playing on the third line, even strength. They're mixing things up, trying to see what works and what doesn't. regardless what line JVR is on. If he manages to stay on that first unit, that's going to be great for his value. I think in a deep league, he's going to be a great add. We'll see how it all plays out, but definitely his stock has went up. The next obvious faller is the opposite of JVR. It's Jake DeBrusk. I thought DeBrusk was a huge sleeper going into the season because his ADP was so low, considering how great he played last year. He got a decent amount of power play time last season as well. I assumed he was going to be on the first unit. Unfortunately, JVR is on there, and hey, if JVR struggles, maybe DeBrusk can find himself on that first unit again, but JVR just scored 2 goals on the power play on Saturday, so very concerned about DeBrusk's deployment. We also saw the Bruins lose Krejci and Bergeron, their 2 best centers, so that definitely hurts DeBrusk. He's going to be playing alongside either Zacha or Coyle. We'll see how it plays out, but for now, DeBrusk could be a drop candidate. I think his stock has fallen quite a bit. Next up, we have some Jets players. Gabriel Vilardi, one of my favorite breakout candidates for this season. I've been talking about this guy for 2 months now. I think he has a lot of potential. The main thing that it really comes down to is deployment. He's playing on the top line with Mark Scheifele and Kyle Connor, and he's getting a ton of power play time on that first unit. I think what really stood out to me is him getting over 20 minutes per game in the 2 games that we've seen of him. So that is extremely promising, guys. He was great on the Kings. I think he was on pace for 29 goals in a full season last year, despite only playing 15 minutes a game. So being alongside all those top tier players like Kyle Connor, Mark Scheifele, I think Vilardi is going to have a lot of points this year. There is a potential for him to put up 25 plus goals, 60 plus points. So if he's sitting on your waiver wire, I suggest you add him. Another riser on the Jets is Alex Iafallo, and this one was very surprising to me. I did not expect Iafallo to be on the first power play unit, but he is, and that means his stock has gone up quite a bit. Now, his average ice time through 2 games is only 14 minutes and 37 seconds, which isn't great. However, if he manages to stay on the first unit, he will be fantasy relevant. Keep a close eye on the deployment for the Jets power play. Maybe Iafallo gets bumped down to the second unit in favor of Ehlers. I don't know, but for now, Iafallo is going to be a great add in a deeper league and a potential great stream throughout the season. Now, if you just watch a previous section, you know what I'm about to say about Nikolaj Ehlers. He's a faller. His stock went down. He's not on the first unit. Iafallo is on that first unit over him, and that's definitely disappointing, guys. What I will say is that Ehlers was injured throughout preseason with a neck issue. I think he had neck spasms or neck cramps, and that could be a factor as to why he's not on the first unit. However, I'm definitely concerned with Ehlers because last year we saw horrible deployment. We basically saw Ehlers getting third line minutes. If we're looking at his total ice time over these 2 games, it was only around 14 minutes. His average power play time was 2 minutes and 25 seconds. This is not good, guys. I think Ehlers has the talent. We've seen him be fantasy relevant in the past. However, it feels like Rick Bowness has him in the doghouse, and he's not going to get the deployment that we want. So Ehlers could definitely be a drop. Maybe things will change. He'll get back on the first unit, but I'm not betting on it. Definitely concerned about Ehlers and his role on the Jets. Next up, we have some Red Wings players. First off, Alex DeBrincat. He has 3 goals in 2 games. He's looked great out there. And we identified him as a bounce back candidate earlier in the season because his shooting percentage last year was so low. Things just didn't work out in Ottawa, but we know that he's 25 years old and he's put up 40 plus goals in the past. So hopefully he keeps this up and has a great year. The next riser on the Red Wings is defenseman Shane Gostisbehere. If you are in need of a defenseman, you need to add this guy immediately. He is on the first unit with Seider, so it's looking like they're going to run 2 defensemen on there. He has 2 assists in 2 games, and as I'm recording this, he just scored a goal, so I think he's going to have a great year if he stays on that unit. Really excited about Gostisbehere. We know he's an offensive beast. We'll see how it all plays out, but definitely promising, and this guy's stock has gone way up. Now, the next Red Wings player I want to talk about is a faller. His stock has went down. It's Lucas Raymond. He did just score in the previous game, but the issue is that he's not on the first unit, right? Gostisbehere is on there right now. It could change. Raymond can find himself on there. He's still on the top line, but it is concerning, guys. You need the first line power play time in order to be fantasy relevant. He's not going to break out without that, so for now, his stock has decreased. Pay very close attention to his deployment for the rest of the year. Next up, we have some Panthers players. We have Evan Rodriguez, who is situated on the top line with Barkov and also on the first unit, so his stock has gone way up. Against Winnipeg, he had 4 points, and as I'm recording this, he just had another point against the Devils, so you need to add this guy immediately. He may cool off, but this deployment is extremely promising, so make sure you take a look at this guy in the waiver wire. The next riser on the Panthers is defenseman Oliver Ekman-Larsson. He is currently averaging the most power play time per game on the Panthers with 6 minutes and 18 seconds. With Brandon Montour and Aaron Ekblad potentially out until January, Oliver Ekman-Larsson is a must-add. He is going to have a lot of value on this first unit. We've seen Ekman-Larsson be a power play specialist in the past, so hopefully he can put up a lot of points on there. If you are in need of a defenseman, you need to add this guy immediately. He could really help your team out. Next up, we have Calgary Flames forward Mangiapane. We identified him as a potential bounce back candidate. His shooting percentage was really low. He was dealing with a shoulder injury all of last year. And obviously Daryl Sutter lost the locker room, which definitely affected chemistry and overall team morale. We saw Mangiapane get off to an extremely hot start, putting up 3 points in his first game. He was on the third line, but they moved him up to the top line with Huberdeau and Lindholm. And if that sticks, that is going to be massive for Mangiapane's fantasy value. Now, he isn't on the first line power play. They have rookie Matt Coronado on there, but I don't think that's going to stick. He scored 35 goals 2 seasons ago, so we know he can put the puck in the net. Hopefully he can get that deployment, and if that's the case, the upside is to the moon. Now I want to talk about a Washington Capitals player, Dylan Strome. His stock has definitely gone down because if we're looking at his power play time, he is not on that first unit, which is super disappointing. I know the Capitals had a lot of injuries last year, which is why Strome was able to get that opportunity on the first unit, but he put up 23 goals and 65 points last year, so I don't understand this decision. We'll see if it changes, but for now, he is not getting looks in that first unit, which means his fantasy value is going way down. Last year, he averaged 3 minutes of power play time per game, but in the one game that we just saw him play in, he only got a minute and 36 seconds. I know it's a very small sample size, but things are concerning, so he might be considered a drop in a more shallow league. If you have Dylan Strome on your team, pay very close attention to his deployment. If he continues to get this little amount of power play time, then he definitely is a drop. Next up, I got to talk about 2 Canes players. The first one being Quinton Byfield, a young player who could break out. He doesn't have first line power play time. However, if we're looking at his total ice time per game over a very small sample size, the first 2 games this season, 17 minutes and 28 seconds. That is very promising. He's getting top line minutes, and he scored a goal in his first 2 games. And just by watching these games, guys, I thought Byfield looked pretty good out there. He certainly passed the eye test. It's early, so we'll see how it develops, but getting that deployment, 17 plus minutes a night, that is going to be big, and he's on this very offensively minded Canes team, so there's certainly potential with Byfield. The next Canes player I want to talk about is Pierre-Luc Dubois, and listen, he doesn't have any points through 2 games. However, Arvidsson is out. He had back surgery. He's going to be out long term, meaning Pierre-Luc Dubois is likely going to be on that first unit. It was kind of concerning that he wasn't on that first unit, but this means more power play time, which means more fantasy production. So that is why he is a riser. I think Dubois has a lot of potential. He has a lot of skill. He's also playing on a line with Kevin Fiala, even strength. So lots of good stuff for Dubois. I expect him to have some big nights and some big weeks. We'll see if he can get some points for week 2. Now I want to talk about 2 Penguins players that I think are fallers. We have Chris Letang, and this is really concerning, guys. At first, during preseason and training camp, they were running 2 defensemen, Erik Karlsson and Chris Letang, on that first unit, but they quickly figured out it wasn't going to work. So Chris Letang is no longer on the first unit. I know it's a small sample size, but through 3 games, Chris Letang has only averaged 39 seconds of power play time per game. It's still early, guys, but this should be very concerning for Letang owners. If he doesn't find himself back on the first unit, his stock goes way down. Next up, we got to talk about some Chicago players. Obviously, Connor Bedard has looked great so far throughout the first 3 games. He has 1 goal and 2 assists, and he is taking so many shots. Now, I told you guys not to draft him because his ADP was very high. On Yahoo, it was like 35. On Drafters, he was even higher. It was like 22. I just felt that he wasn't worth it at his price. However, if he fell in drafts, you may have gotten good value. I still have some concerns about Bedard because if you look at the Blackhawks lines, they look so terrible on paper. Their power play units look terrible. It's just tough when they don't have a lot of depth. It's going to be tough for Bedard to really reach that ceiling. However, if he keeps playing like this, then he is going to be really good in fantasy, especially with that shot volume. So we'll see how it plays out. I hope he does well. I wish well for the kid. I hope that he can put up 35 plus goals and 70 plus points. We'll see what happens. The next Blackhawks riser I got to talk about is Ryan Donato, and I'm not telling you guys to go out and pick him up. However, as things stand, he's playing on the first line with Connor Bedard and on the first line power play unit. So if that stays the same, he will have value. I'll say this again, but proceed with caution. I wouldn't say he's a long-term hold, but he could be good for now with that deployment. We'll see how it plays out. In a deep league, he could be a very good add. Next up, we have a riser, Mike Matheson of the Montreal Canadiens. I told you guys he was such a massive sleeper going into these drafts. He was going so late. He played incredible last year. He's a staple on that first line power play. He gets tons of time on ice. His peripherals are incredible. And I think as long as he can stay healthy, he can put up 50 plus points, 10 plus goals with great shots, hits, and blocks. Next up for the fallers, we have basically the entire Kraken roster. In my opinion, the Kraken overperformed last year. A lot of the players last season overperformed, and they are due for some regression. We already saw some of this in their first 3 games this season. I know it's a small sample size, guys, but I really do think that a lot of Kraken players are not going to be fantasy relevant. This is not only because of the regression that I was expecting, it's because they run a very balanced offense. They run 3 lines, they run 2 power play units, so you're not going to have these players get heavy time on ice averages. It's not going to happen, and that's just not good for fantasy production. So in general, just not a big fan of the players on the Kraken. Maybe they can turn it around, but based off that stuff, the fact that they run a balanced offense, I'm just not high on it. I'm not going to be touching those players on the wire. We'll see how it plays out. Next up, I want to talk about some Predators players, and I will say that this is subject to change. This is because a lot of this information that I'm about to give you is based on the power play lines that we've seen so far through 3 games. They're mixing up their lines in practice, so the power play lines that we saw for the first 3 games might look very differently in about a week. We'll see how it all plays out. They're still experimenting. Either way, it's looking like Ryan O'Reilly is going to get top line minutes and be a staple on that first unit. So his stock is definitely risen. Basically, it comes down to deployment, guys. Through these first 3 games, he's averaging over 20 minutes of ice time per game. He's 4th among Nashville Predators players in power play time, so it's looking like he's going to stay on the first unit. I know O'Reilly was terrible on the Blues last year. He was pretty good on the Leafs, but if he continues to get this deployment, I'm expecting him to be fantasy relevant. So if you're in a deeper league and he's still in the wire, definitely take a look at him. The last riser on the Predators is Cody Glass, and I could have mentioned Tyson Barrie as well because he was getting looks on the first unit through these first 3 games. However, we learned in practice today that they've moved Barrie down to the second unit. The reason Glass is on here is because through these first 3 games, Glass has been on the first unit, and in practice today, he's still on that first unit, which means that his fantasy value has absolutely risen. Glass doesn't have any points in 3 games, but the fact that he's on that first unit and he's getting 16 minutes of ice time per game is promising, so make sure you keep an eye out for him on the waiver wire. All right, the next player I want to talk about is Brock Faber of the Minnesota Wild. He's a rookie defenseman, and I just want to preface this with saying that he is only an ad in a very deep league. He gets no power play time, and he's benefiting from Jared Spurgeon being out week to week, so this is a guy that you don't want to add in a more shallow league. I know he's played really good in his first 2 games, but I'm not expecting much from him. I thought I'd say that. But either way, guys, let's look at his stats for his first 2 games. He has 1 goal and 1 assist in 2 games, but what really stands out is his time on ice. He's averaging over 22 minutes of ice time per game. That's 2nd among all Minnesota Wild players. Again, when Spurgeon comes back, this is going to change. He still gets no power play time. It's just not going to be worth it dropping an established player for Brock Faber at this point. Keep an eye out for him. Maybe he continues this production. I'm not expecting him to, but still, guys, I wanted to give a shout out to him. It's good for the Minnesota Wild, who need defensemen on their team. And yeah, we'll see how he develops throughout the year. Next up, I got to talk about a faller, and this is very preliminary because the Islanders have only played 1 game. However, Ondrej got bumped down to the 3rd line. I don't know if that's going to stick, but in his first game, he only played 14 minutes. He averaged the 6th most power play time on the Islanders behind Kyle Palmieri, so he's not on the first unit. We'll see how it plays out, guys, but not a big fan of Ondrej if that's his type of deployment. I'll keep you guys updated in my future videos on how it develops, but for now, I would be a little bit concerned. Now, I quickly want to talk about some Rangers players. We first got to talk about Vincent Trocheck. There was some concern earlier on in the preseason that they were going to not put Trocheck on the first line power play, which is a reason he fell a lot in drafts. However, he is on that first unit still. It makes sense for him to be on the bumper on that unit, so Trocheck is still going to have a lot of fantasy value this season. He's also averaging almost 20 minutes of ice time per game through 2 games, so really like Trocheck, especially in a league that counts hits. He puts up so many hits. He takes a lot of shots. I'm not worried about him whatsoever, even if he's on the 3rd line. He's getting like bumped up to the second and first line some games, so they're trying to experiment with these lines. We'll see how it all plays out, but it looks like he is going to stay on that first unit. The next Rangers player is a faller. It is Blake Wheeler. He's only averaging 13 minutes and 36 seconds of ice time per game. He's getting bottom 6 minutes. He is not on the first line power play, which some people thought he maybe would. So yeah, basically Blake Wheeler is not a guy that you should have drafted. I told you guys not to draft him. Maybe he gets some top line minutes in the future. I'm not expecting him to because he is getting up there in age. The Rangers are so stacked. You don't want to be giving Wheeler ice time over guys like Kakko, Lafreniere, those type of young players that deserve ice time. So not expecting Wheeler to be fantasy relevant this year. Next up, I want to give a shout out to Jacob Chychrun. He has 2 goals and 2 assists in 3 games. Now he's not on the first line power play unit, but I've said this in the past. He was in my must draft defensive video. Chychrun has a lot of potential if he can stay healthy. We saw how good Chychrun could be on the Arizona Coyotes. In the 2020-2021 season, he had 18 goals in 56 games. That's an 82 game pace of 26 goals, which is absolutely elite for a defenseman. We know that Chychrun has one of the best shots out of any defenseman in the NHL, so there is a chance that Sens give him a look on the first unit. Having that type of shot on the power play is going to be elite, so we'll see what happens. Regardless if he's on the first unit or the second unit, he still has a lot of upside being in the Sens offense, so I really like Chychrun this year. The last Sens riser I got to talk about is defenseman Jake Sanderson. He isn't on the first line power play unit, which definitely caps the ceiling. However, based off the small sample size of 3 games, he has looked absolutely incredible. He has 1 goal and a total of 3 points in 3 games. He's been a stud on both ends of the ice. We'll see how he develops throughout the season, but based off the Sens games that I watched, he definitely passed the eye test. I think regardless if he finds himself on the first unit, he still can put up 50 plus points. So lots of potential for Sanderson. Now for the faller on the Sens, I got to talk about Josh Norris. I understand that he hasn't played any games, and that's the main reason he's a faller. He was set to play in preseason games, and he had a setback. We saw even last year, right? He was getting ready to return, and then he had a setback, and he was out for the rest of the year. So I am just not optimistic about Norris at all. I don't know what the setback was. I don't know how severe his injury is. I'm just really concerned about it, so that's why he's on this list as a faller. I still think there is potential upside because he scored 35 goals in the last season that he played in, but just based off the setbacks that he's had, these shoulder injuries, I just can't be excited about him returning. We'll see how he plays when he comes back, but for now, I'm absolutely concerned. Next up, we got some Flyers players to talk about. We got riser Cam York, defenseman. He's quarterbacking the first line power play unit, which is definitely promising. I know the Flyers don't have the best power play, but still, guys, I identified him as a breakout candidate a couple of months ago, and the games that I've watched of the Flyers this year, he's looked really good. He's averaging almost 22 minutes of ice time per game, and through these 2 games, he's averaging the most power play time as well. I know it's a very small sample size, but this is definitely promising. If you are in need of a defenseman, definitely take a look at Cam York on the waiver wire. His roster percentage is super low, and he absolutely has upside. The next Flyers riser is Travis Konechny. I told you guys how good of a value he was on Yahoo. His ADP was far too low, but I should have told you to draft him more because I was drafting him a ton. In fact, in the 50 teams that I've drafted, I almost have 30% of Konechny on those teams. He is going to be really good this year if he can stay healthy, and he's picked up right where he left off last season, putting up 3 goals and a total of 4 points in 2 games. The Flyers are still going to be one of the worst teams in the NHL, and they're not going to have a great power play, but regardless, I think Konechny is going to be very fantasy relevant, so if he's on your team, I think you should hold on to him. All right, moving on to the fallers for the Flyers, we have Owen Tippett, and this is very disappointing, guys. I pinned him as a breakout. He played really good in the second half of last year. He also puts up amazing peripherals, amazing shots, hits, and blocks. So that's why I identified him as a breakout and a guy you should draft. He was going to have that safe floor with those peripherals, and there is a potential for him to put up 30 plus goals. Unfortunately, his deployment has been atrocious so far, so let's break it down. To start things off, his ice time per game has not been great whatsoever. Through 2 games, he's averaging 14 minutes and 52 seconds of ice time per game. That is not going to cut it, and what's even worse is that he's not on the first line power play. In my opinion, Tippett is way better than Cam Atkinson at this point in their career, so Atkinson should be on the second unit and Tippett should be on the first unit. That's just not happening right now. We know that Atkinson and Torts go way back on Columbus. We'll see if that changes, but that is one big concern. Atkinson being on the first line power play and Tippett not. We also saw basically Bobby Brink being on the bumper on that first unit, and then Brink got injured and they put Forrester over Tippett, so just not good stuff at all. I still think Tippett could pop off because we saw how good he was last year. He just needs to get on that first unit. I'm not telling you guys to drop him, but I am telling you guys to be concerned. Definitely keep an eye on him and his deployment. I'll be keeping you guys up to date with that. It's definitely a cause for concern, but guys, do not panic. We're 2 games into the NHL season. It's a very small sample size. He could easily have a big night and things can turn around, so we'll see how it plays out. I am concerned, but I'm not panicking just yet. Next up, we quickly got to talk about Austin Matthews, guys. We identified him as a bounce back candidate for this season, and he has not disappointed. In his first 2 games, he has back-to-back hat tricks, 6 goals in 2 games. Now, I'm going to post this Tuesday, but as I'm recording this, we know tonight he's playing the Blackhawks. We'll see if he can do it again. Basically, with Matthews, we know that his shooting percentage was super low last year. We know that he was dealing with injuries. And now he has Durzi on his top line with Marner, so that could really help him as well. We'll see if he can keep this up, but in general, guys, I am expecting him to bounce back for the rest of the season if he can stay healthy. He is a guy that was just as good as McDavid 2 years ago in fantasy hockey, so very exciting stuff if you drafted Matthews, especially if you got him after 4. The next Leafs player I want to talk about is John Klingberg, and this guy's absolutely a riser. He is on that first line power play unit with Matthews, Marner, Nylander, Tavares, and that means his fantasy value has gone way up. The Leafs offense looks incredible, and he has 3 assists in 2 games, one of these assists being on the power play. I'm expecting him to stay on that first unit. We'll see how this develops throughout the season. I don't think Riley's going to take back that spot, so really high in Klingberg. I think he has the potential to put up 60 plus points, and I'm really excited about it. Considering we just talked about Klingberg, I got to talk about a faller on the Maple Leafs. That is Morgan Riley. He is no longer on the first unit. I don't think he is going to get that spot back. Yes, he has 3 points in 2 games. He's still going to put up points, even strength, but without first line power play time, a very coveted spot on such a great offense, his fantasy value is going to go way down. I told you not to draft him. I felt like his ADP was still too high, even if it dipped. So yeah, guys, not a fan of Riley for this year, and I think that he is probably going to get dropped a lot in the near future. All right, now I want to talk about another riser on the Leafs. It's backup goaltender Joseph Woll, and I understand I told you guys Ilya Samsonov was a must-draft goalie for this season, and I'm still sticking by it. It's only been 2 games. Samsonov played pretty bad, I understand, but still, it's such a small sample size. The reason why Woll is a riser on this list is because obviously Samsonov hasn't played great. We also just saw him start against the Blackhawks. It wasn't a back-to-back. They just gave him the start because of the poor performance from Samsonov. They did lose 4-1 against the Blackhawks tonight. Woll didn't play bad. The defense kind of left him out to dry, but still, guys, it is something to keep an eye on. The Leafs are one of the best teams in the league, so if Woll continues to get starts like this, then he's going to have value in fantasy. If he's sitting on your waiver wire and you need a goalie, he could be a very good stash. One riser I got to talk about is Jordan Binnington. I know it's such a small sample size, and we can't really talk about goalies when, we're talking about 2 games. However, Binnington has looked really good in the 2 games that he's played in. The reason why I wanted to include him is because if you're in a points league where volume is key, we know that Binnington gets a ton of starts. Last year, he got 60 plus starts. So if he can actually manage to not be terrible, he's going to have a lot of value. If you're in need for a goalie and Binnington is sitting on your waiver wire, I say give him a shot, add him for a week or 2, see how he plays. If he continues to put up these type of numbers, things are going to look very promising, so definitely a riser on this list. Lastly, we got to talk about 2 Colorado Avalanche players. The first one is a riser, Ryan Johansson. I understand he has no points in 3 games. However, he is situated on that first power play unit on Colorado, which is extremely valuable. There is absolutely a chance this could change. We could see Nichushkin get back up there, but for now, Ryan Johansson has a lot of value. He's going to have a big night at some point. We'll see how it plays out, but for now, he's a good add in a deeper league and a great stream. The last player I want to talk about is a guy whose stock has gone down considerably in the last couple of weeks, and that player is Valeri Nichushkin of the Colorado Avalanche. And listen, guys, don't get mad at me. I know in September when I made my sleeper video, I talked about him being one of the biggest sleepers in fantasy hockey, and he was at the time. Last season, he was incredible. He averaged more fantasy points per game than so many players that were going way ahead of him. Unfortunately, that video was recorded before we started getting reports out of training camp that he wasn't going to be on the first power play unit. He was on that unit last year and he was great. I expected him to be on that unit once again. However, that has not been the case. Right now, it's Makar, Rantanen, and McKinnon, Arturi Lehkonen, and Ryan Johansson. I do think there is a potential for Nichushkin to get back on this first unit. In fact, McKinnon made a comment about a week ago how he thinks Nichushkin could get back on the first unit at some point. He talked about him being a great net front presence, and I agree with this. So Nichushkin could be a good buy low candidate. Regardless, guys, Nichushkin's value has tanked quite a bit. He needs to get back on that first unit to be fantasy relevant. He's still going to be okay, but being on the Colorado power play is so valuable. We'll see what happens, but it's not looking good right now. All right, boys, that's the end of the video. This one took a lot of work, a lot of time to record, so make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel, and I will catch you in the next one.